Well, we had, for the first time in our hands, a long-range interceptor. It was clear that the F-4 was designed to fill a very deficient gap. We had entered a period when attack was high speed. We needed standoff. We needed quick responsiveness. We needed a all-weather capability, and that's what we achieved in the F-4.
If you had it to do all over again, is there anything you would do to change the design of the F-4 or the test program?
No, I wouldn't change a thing.
Alright guys, welcome back to DCS World. I'm Spud, as always. And today we're going to take a look at the most important weapon delivery mode in the brand new DCS F-4E Phantom II, Dive Toss. We're tackling Dive Toss first in our DCS F-4E Phantom II tutorial series because it serves as both the easiest, most flexible, and accurate way to deliver free-fall munitions, and it forms the building blocks and the basis for all of the other weapon delivery methods, such as target find for delivering LGBs. Dive Toss was used to great effect by American, Israeli, and Iranian F-4E pilots in the latter stages of the Vietnam War, including Operations Linebacker 1 and 2, the Yom Kippur War, the 1982 Lebanon War, and the Iran-Iraq War. You can actually read all about how the new Echo variant of the F-4 and Dive Toss revolutionized dumb bombing techniques in the later stages of the Vietnam War in Ed Rasimus's fantastic memoir, Palace Cobra, a must-read if you are a Phantom Phanatic. While it was a forefather of the highly accurate and computerized CCIP and CCRP systems of the F-10 series and other fighters, in the F-4E, Dive Toss is a very hands-on system that requires good crew coordination and systems knowledge. So let's talk a little bit about how Dive Toss works behind the scenes, and then we'll put it into practice together and show you guys how to use it in combat. In simple terms, Dive Toss mode allows the WRCS, or Weapons Release Computer Set, to calculate a precise moment to release your weapon or weapons to impact your chosen target through inputs from various aircraft sensors, just like it does today with CCIP and CCRP. It accomplishes this by the Wizzo first inserting the drag coefficient of the weapon you desire to use into the WRCS, so it can predict the flight path of the weapon once it leaves the aircraft. The WRCS then uses a number of the aircraft sensors to compute the precise moment to release the weapon in order to accurately impact the desired target. These sensor inputs include, but are not limited to, ranging information from a ground return radar lock in close proximity to the intended target, initiated by your Wizzo or Jester in the dive through coordination with the pilot up front, INS and air data computer information including aircraft ground speed, attitude, altitude, and vertical speed, as well as range to the intended target, through the pilot pressing the bomb button while visually tracking the intended target with the pipper slave to the radar bore sight line. Once all of these inputs have been inserted into the WRCS, both manually and automatically, and the pilot is pressing and holding the bomb button, a gentle and constant rate pullout away from the target allows the WRCS to drop the weapon or weapons at the appropriate moment to impact the target. So now that we've gone through a very basic overview of how the system works under the hood, let's go through a live demonstration to get you guys up and running with using Dive Toss on day one of release of the F-4E. Alrighty guys, for the rest of today's video, we're going to be swapping over to a live demonstration and tutorial format. We're currently flying at the very height of the 1970 to 73 War of Attrition, fought between Israel and Egypt across the Suez Canal. We're currently flying out towards a very juicy target, a couple of newly delivered MiG-21s straight from the Soviet Union at Al Mansura Air Base, deep in the Nile River Delta, and in some of the most heavily defended airspace in the entire world at this point. Now, the F-4E Kernos is still very new to the inventory of the IDF-AF, and its capabilities within the IDF-AF are still being fleshed out. We're currently carrying 2 Sergeant Fletcher drop tanks, 12 Mark 82s on the inboard stations and centerline stations, 3 AIM-7 E-2 dogfight Sparrows, and an ALQ ECM pod. Let's hop into the office and get started with our dive toss tutorial. We are feet dry at this point, and once we cross the Suez Canal, we'll be firmly inside bad guy territory. At hour 2, moving to our 3 o'clock, is Port Said, the very focal point of the 1956 Suez Crisis, fought between a coalition of Israel, the UK, and France against the Republic of Egypt over the nationalization of the Suez Canal by President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Most historians will point to the 56 crisis as the last gasp of the British Empire and the rise of Israel as a regional power within the Middle East. And Jester is starting to warn us about those air defenses that we talked about earlier. And why don't we turn on some internal cockpit lighting here to make things a bit easier for you guys to see on YouTube. And before we talk about how to actually perform a dive toss delivery of unguided munitions, let's take a look at the keybinds we're going to need to use. So we'll hit escape and go to our adjust controls menu here. And the first keybind we're going to need that's pretty obvious is of course the bomb button. This is going to be the button that will allow us to insert the range to our actual specified target into the WRCS system, and by pressing and holding this button, it's going to authorize the aircraft to release our weapons from our aircraft at the exact right moment to get a good impact onto our target. The next button that we're going to need is not quite as explicitly laid out in the manual as it should be, in my opinion. This is the Jester Context Action. This is going to allow us to interact with Jester without having to open up the Jester radial menu to get him to lock onto the ground in the vicinity of our target for initial radar ranging to be inserted into the WRCS as part of our dive toss delivery. Now, this is a fantastic addition to Jester in the F-4E here as part of Jester 2.0 that allows us to interact with Jester in a contextual way without having to always open up the Jester menu, which is absolutely fantastic. So 2 thumbs up for Heatblur there. Now let's move back to our cockpit and start talking about how to perform that dive toss delivery. Now, here in the F-4E, there are a number of things that we need to do to prepare the cockpit for things such as a dive toss delivery or air-to-air combat that are more or less automated in the more modern aircraft that you're probably used to here in DCS World. As a result of that, I highly recommend that you come up with a flow across the cockpit that is easy and repeatable to reduce the number of mistakes you might make, and then trap those mistakes and allow you to fix them very, very quickly and easily. So let's set up the cockpit for our dive toss delivery. We'll turn on the flashlight here to highlight things to make things a little bit easier for you, but I like to kind of flow around the cockpit starting from the LCOS, moving down to the DSCG panel, down to our fusing options, our station select buttons, our master arm, and onto the AWRU panel, and finishing off in the center pedestal if I'm using Pave Spike, a Walleye, a Maverick, or a Hobos, etc. So first thing we're going to do is bring our LCOS over to air-to-ground mode and ensure that we have our depression set to 0 mil, so that way our Pipper is slave to the RBL, or radar bore sight line. Next, we're going to move down to our fusing options. By default in the F-4E, On an air start, these will be set to tail, but we're going to move that over to nose and tail to reduce the chances of having any duds when our bombs impact the target. Next, we're going to select all of the stations that are currently loaded with Mark 82s on our aircraft. You saw that earlier in the video. We're then going to set our master arm to the arm position and move down to our weapons release select knob and bring it over to the DT position for dive toss. For our weapon selector knob, we're going to bring it over to the bombs position. Once you have the appropriate stations selected, the appropriate delivery method selected, and the appropriate weapon selected, you'll see the yellow arm lights pop up as a good check to let you know that you've done everything correctly. Moving down on the AWRU panel, or Aircraft Weapon Release Unit panel, we're going to leave the interval set to the default 0.05 for a nice close spread of our weapons on release. And then for our quantity, we'll go ahead and select 6. We're currently carrying 12 Mark 82s, and this will give us 2 passes on our selected target. Now, like I said earlier, if I was using a walleye or any other TV-guided weapon, I'd want to bring this switch over to TV, but we'll leave it in radar for our dive toss method today. For dive toss or any other advanced release method, we want to ensure that we are navigating via our INS system for both our ADI and our HSI. So ensure that both knobs are set to nav computer as opposed to TACAN, ADF, VOR, etc. Next, we need to tell the WRCS, or Weapon Release Computer Set, the drag coefficient of our selected weapon, in this case a Mark 82. To do this, all we need to do is bring up our bombing table by hitting B on your keyboard by default, and then coming up and changing the mode of delivery to DT in dive toss. And what makes dive toss so easy and so perfect for using against targets of opportunity, things of that nature, is the fact that the run-in speed, release altitude, target altitude, and dive angle don't matter at all. The only things that matter are the type of weapon as well as the drag coefficient. So to get our bombing table to calculate our drag coefficient for a Mark 82, all we need to do is just change and adjust one of these values. Like I said, these values don't matter. You can set them to whatever you want. Getting a little bit close to our target area here, so why don't we pause the simulation to give us a little bit more time. We have drag coefficient populated for our Mark 82s. We can hit the Tell Jester or the Tell Jester and Close button to have him input the coefficient value into the WRCS panel in the back seat. However, before we do that, we're going to go ahead and come down to the pattern options down below so we can talk about Release Advance. Now, Release Advance can be rather confusing and may take a while for you to kind of wrap your mind around the subject, but don't worry, it was confusing for me at first as well. In the modern aircraft you may be used to flying in DCS, such as the Tomcat or the Strike Eagle or the Viper or the Hornet, when you roll in on a target for a CCIP delivery, the reticle for your CCIP delivery represents the very center of the stick of bombs and where they're going to impact the target. The F-4E is not that smart, and we have to actually tell the jet where the center of that stick of bombs is going to be. So that way the pipper of our LCOS here can represent the center of the impact point of the number of bombs that you're going to drop. If you were to not input a release advance value into the WRCS, your reticle would represent where the very first bomb of your stick of bombs would impact the target, which may be desirable in some cases, but also may not be desirable in other cases. If you find that your bombs are usually going long across your target, then you may want to ensure that you put in a release advance value before you actually drop those weapons. So the way we do this is we actually plug in a bunch of variables into a rather complex mathematical formula, but thankfully the bombing table here and gesture in the back can do that automatically for you. Essentially, we need to input the release interval, which is set to 0.05, the default setting that we had on the AWRU down below. The interval multiplier is set to norm, which we had set to norm down here as well. And then we need to tell the formula the bomb on target that we want to be represented by the pipper on our L class. Now, because we're going to drop 6 bombs with each pass, we want to have either bomb number 3 or 4 set, so that way our pipper can represent the very center of that stick of bombs. Now, of course, we're not dropping an odd number of bombs here, so of course we're not going to get it directly in the center, but it's going to be close enough. Now, essentially, once we input that value of bomb on target, we can see the release advance populates with a value here of 100 milliseconds. Essentially what that means is the WRCS is going to drop our weapons 100 milliseconds early or earlier than it thinks it should, so that way our pipper represents the very center of that stick of bombs across the target. So hopefully that makes some kind of sense, and we'll go ahead and unpause the simulation here. We'll get Jester to input all of these values into the WRCS, and then we'll go for our bombing run. So let's go ahead and continue here, guys.
Roger. Roger. Yep.
Okay, Jester has those values inputted, and we can start to see our target area out in front of us here. So we'll kind of get lined back up onto our target a little bit better. We'll keep trimming out our aircraft so that way she's nice and easy to fly. And because we kicked the autopilot off, we'll go ahead and reset the master caution system. Just going to double check that we did our flow correctly and we have everything set and ready to go. Everything is looking good. And as we get closer to our target here, why don't we go ahead and pop up, so that way we can get a nice steep dive onto our target area. And we'll kind of come off to the left-hand side, or the right-hand side, I should say, so that way we can do a proper roll-in maneuver and be able to identify our targets as early as possible. And we can see Al Mansoura airfield down there. And we know the Big 21s are parked to the southerly area of the airfield down there. Let's kind of zoom in a little bit, see if we can get our eyes on them. There they are, perfect. Just gonna wait just a little bit more here, be patient, 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 so we get a nice steep dive. All right. At this point, we're going to initiate our dive onto the target. In dive toss, you want to have a nice steep dive onto your target, so that way the air-to-ground radar can lock onto the ground as easily and quickly as possible. And we'll go ahead and pause the simulation for just a moment here so we can talk about it. But essentially, we now need to hit the Jester context button, so that way we can command Jester in the back seat here to lock the ground. Now we want to have our pipper as close to the targets as possible when we tell Jester to command the lock. This will allow us to have as accurate of a delivery as possible. Where we are right now is pretty good because it's a good level surface of the ground here, but ideally we want to move this pipper a little bit closer before we actually command Jester to make the lock. So as you're diving in on your target in dive toss, you want to be nice and patient. You want to fly nice and smoothly, nice and gently to really get as accurate of a lock onto the ground as possible with your air-to-ground radar. So let's go ahead and unpause here. All right, we'll command the lock. Boom. Okay, we know that Jester has gotten a lock on the ground here when we see a range bar pop up in our LCOS sight here. as well as we'll see the lock symbology on the radar scope down below. And I paused it a little bit too early here, but you're also going to hear Jester make a verbal call out of, yep, I've got the ground locked, or something of that nature. There's a couple different voiceover files for that. Now at this point, what we want to do is we want to press and hold the bomb button once we get our pipper directly on top of the target we want to hit. Locking the radar onto the ground essentially gives the WRCS initial radar ranging to the target. Then, once we kind of line up our pipper right on top of the target we actually want to hit with our bombs, that's going to give the very precise ranging information and allow the WRCS to release the bombs in a fashion that's going to allow for the most accurate delivery. So with that, let's go ahead and get going. So we'll go ahead and unpause again. We're going to press and hold. And we can feel and hear those bombs come off the jet. And we're going to take a look over our shoulder. And boom, wow. Right through the middle of those MiG-21s parked on the ramp. Absolutely perfect. Alright, I can see another lineup of MiGs down there for us to engage. So we'll go ahead and set up for another bombing run. And we'll set up in a manner that will allow us to fly out to the east, back towards the Suez Canal, and back to safety, and hopefully drag any interceptors into a flight of awaiting Shahaks to engage the MiGs that'll be following us home. Now, a really good technique is to pull your hand off the throttle and press and hold that bomb button with your left hand, so that way you can get a nice smooth pullout and get as accurate and smooth of a pullout away from the target as possible. Alright, so let's initiate our next dive. Take a look for those MiGs down there. Alright, I see them. We're going to tell Jester to lock the ground. Okay, we've got a nice lock. That's looking good. Left hand on the bomb button. We're going to start pulling out. There we go. Weapons are away. Let's look over our shoulder. And nice. Right across where those additional MiG-21s were parked. Those are 6 MiG-21s that are definitely not going to be flying to a challenge Israeli air superiority over the Suez Canal zone anytime soon or ever again. So I hope this video helps you guys out, and I hope that it kind of demonstrates that dive toss is really not hard for you, and it is a very easy and very accurate way to get dumb bombs on the target. So we'll see you on the next one, guys. Fly safe out there, and enjoy this beautiful game and your new beautiful F-4E Phantom II.